Okay, let's see if we can do Daniel chapter 6 or week 6 of our Daniel class that we've been going through. Here we are with the a review. Chapter 1 was probably not about kosher issues. They didn't want to eat the king's food from the king's table, so that we're holding ourselves some distance from the king. But they also then ask for not so much vegetables. They use a peculiar word, seeds. Give us seeds and water. And I think that's to make us suspect that God is doing a new planting. He's going to take some seeds and scatter them and water them and make something new grow. Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's great dream. His empire dream sees the four phases of the world empire. Israel basically is over as an independent kingdom. They're never going to have a king and a land and a temple all together again. And so they are then being taken care of or shepherded and ruled, overseen by empires. So it's going to be Babylon, and then Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. And then chapter 2 then also signals that empire phase of history by putting it into the Aramaic language. Aramaic is the language of the nations. Then at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, though, he sees the great mountain come and break the feet of the statue. The statue is destroyed, and the kingdom of heaven then grows and fills everything. So the kingdom of heaven being at hand is it should be a startling preaching message when we hear it from John the Baptist and from Jesus. And of course, the great thing in chapter 2 at the end is that kid Daniel, who would be in his teen years probably, is advanced and set over the whole province of Babylon. And of course, this is early in the timeline while Jerusalem is still standing. Daniel has that kind of advancement and set and standing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into the burning fiery furnace in chapter 3. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is humbled, becomes like a beast. And then chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar is gone, and it's his grandson, Belshazzar, who is having a feast on the night that his kingdom is going to be taken away from him, and sees the handwriting on the wall. We looked at that in our last lesson. So today we come to the great Daniel and the Lion's Den chapter, probably one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture. Here's our timeline. We're in chapter 6 now, and we're in 539 BC. Look all the way back up at chapter 1, 605. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, is still on the throne. Chapter 2, 603. Nebuchadnezzar, it's only his second year. Chapter 3, about 600 BC for the burning fiery furnace. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's beast-like declension, 593 or so. Now, by this time, Ezekiel has been taken in the second group. We've got a three-stage exile. Daniel and his guys are taken 607, something like that. Earlier, not until 598 is phase 2 of the exile happen, and then not until 586, 587 is Jerusalem finally been destroyed, and in the third phase of the exile begins. During the first part of the exile, though, Group 1 and Group 2, Daniel is in charge. He's in high place of authority, at least down through chapter 4, as long as Nebuchadnezzar lives. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562, so by the time we get to the handwriting on the wall, Daniel is an old man by now, 539 or so. He's been around for decades. He's probably in his 80s at least. And his high standing in Babylon is over, but we're going to see today that the new Persian emperor, Darius, comes in and gives him great advancement there. The last chapters of Daniel, from chapter 5 on, all happen after a long period, 50 years of silence, and then all at once, because now the exile is nearing an end. We're ready for the return, and so things start popping. Here we go, Daniel chapter 6. Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So the plot is laid and the wheels begin to turn. The first question, though, is who's Darius the Mede? The Hebrew Bible, by the way, has chapter 5, verse 31 as the first verse of chapter 6. Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, etc. So this Darius theme is not tacked on to the end of 5. It's actually the beginning of chapter 6. It's a hinge, either way you look at it. But the big question is, who's Darius the Mede? And this is where unbelieving and skeptical scholars dogpile on Daniel. Not only do they not believe that there was an actual Daniel who was alive during the exile and actually wrote this book, they tend to date the book of Daniel much, much later, but they also point out that there is no Darius in history who was there to take over after this should be Belteshazzar, it should be Belshazzar. So everyone points fingers at the at the Bible here, and those ignorant post-exilic Hebrews, they really blundered here, and those ignorant fundies, those evangelicals who believe the whole Bible, they're believing silly things here, because we know from history that that there is no such thing as a Darius the Mede who received the kingdom. So who is he? This is the kind of thing that you read from these guys. They say, "Oh, the book of Daniel is not regarded by scholars as a reliable guide to history. The broad consensus is that Daniel never existed, and that the author appears to have taken the name from a legendary hero of the distant past who is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel." And by the way, Darius the Mede is mentioned in the book of Daniel as king of Babylon between Belshazzar and Cyrus the Great. But he's not known to history, and no additional king can be placed between known figures of Belshazzar and Cyrus. So most scholars view him as a literary fiction. So those are the stones that they throw. So who is Darius the Mede? Believing scholars, of course, these questions have been answered, and there's various ways to try to understand that. Not everyone has the same solution, but there are plenty of alternative ways to do this other than just absolute skepticism. Believing scholars have found 3 or 4 Darius candidates, and one of those constructions might be right. And so there's no need to just throw up your hands and declare, "Oh, I guess we were wrong. The Bible is full of errors after all." No. One of the best views, though, that comes, that I think the best way to understand this comes from those who say that Darius the Mede is the same guy as Cyrus the Persian. When he is wearing his Mede hat, he is called Darius. When he's wearing his Persian hat, he was called Cyrus. He's got 2 names, a Persian name and a Median name. It's like James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. You can call him either one depending on which kind of hat he's wearing and where he's standing. It's the same. I mean, there are lots of examples in Scripture of officials with different names. Daniel is Daniel, the Hebrew prophet, but he's also called Belteshazzar when he's referred to as the Babylonian official. So you've got different names for different cases. This Cyrus Darius, he was Persian on his father's side, but on his mother's side, he was the grandson of a Median king. Okay, so he's both Median and Persian. And I think Daniel makes the point of calling him Darius the Mede because both Isaiah and Jeremiah had foretold that Babylon would be destroyed by the Medes. And so when we come to the point where Babylon is conquered and the next king comes in, he is Darius the Mede, which calls attention to and answers the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah. So when we come to the last verse of chapter 6, we could read it, verse 28. This Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That's how most English translations do it. But that "and" there is just a little conjunction, and it has lots of flexibility. It's used in many different ways. So you could read it, this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, that is the reign of Cyrus the Persian, or this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian. We're not bound, verse 28 does not prevent us from making this identification, which I think really relieves all the so-called problems of this text. So Darius the Mede, Cyrus the Persian, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And he's going to set over 3 high officials, of whom Daniel is one. Notice here that Daniel is shown immediate high favor and trust. So how did Darius choose Daniel out of all these guys? Here's Daniel. He's an old guy, a small cubicle down at the end of the hall. Later, Darius has a deep concern for Daniel when he's in the lion's den. He's anguished. It's hardly from what you'd expect from an emperor who comes in, and where does he get this deep care for this adopted functionary from the previous empire? And we don't know. It could be this, it could be that. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities there. None we don't really need to know, since it's not what the story is about. So you are free at this point to create your own backstory. How did Darius, how did Cyrus get to know Daniel in the first place, and have this high regard for him, so that when he moves in, he says, "I've got to have that guy as one of my top 3." It's an interesting kind of thing to wonder about, but not really part of the story here. So we go on. We're in Daniel 6, and down in verse 4, the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel. This is the theme that comes all the way through empire time. It was there were jealous officials back at the beginning of the book in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Now we've got jealous officials under Cyrus in the time of the Persians, the Medes. The theme of jealous officials just never goes away because this is a story about world empires and not just Israel. And so with a world empire, you're always going to have power, politics as part of the equation, part of the picture. So these high officials and satraps, they came by agreement to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction. Sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." And therefore King Darius signed the document and injunction. Well, first of all, notice that these guys are lying to Darius as official, but Daniel is one of the top 3, and they say that all the high officials, Daniel was one of the top 3 high officials, and he didn't agree. So obviously he was not consulted. But these guys come in and they want Darius to believe that Daniel is on board with this proposal. So Darius, unfortunately, believes these liars. And then you have to kind of wonder, why did this law seem like such a good idea? Exactly what was appealing about it? Darius responds and says, "Hey, this is a great idea." Well, remember that Nabonidus, the next king of back in Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus had moved all the empire's idols to Babylon. Every little kingdom that was part of the empire, they looted its temple. They brought out all the gold, the silver, the idols, all the stuff, and they took it to Babylon. And it eventually ends up in Belshazzar's feast the night before he's killed. But it leaves all the temples of the land empty. And so none of the citizens out there have any gods to pray to. And that means we are going to force you to turn to Babylon, turn to the capital, look to the empire for your petitions and your needs. These are the guys, it's not the God in your temple who's in charge, it's the emperor who's in charge. So that's the contest here in empire time, is who's really in charge. So this maybe is a good idea. Let's let all the peoples out there, every little kingdom, let them all now appeal to their new emperor Darius, the Mede, Cyrus the Persian. And let them do that for a whole month. And that will teach them. They can learn who really has the power to make life happy or miserable. So whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days except you, O king. We're going to cast him into the den of lions. Ancient kings loved to collect exotic and powerful animals. A king who could parade through his capital city with captive enemy kings and a menagerie of subdued beasts. He was showing his people who's the king around here, who's really in control. And lions is interesting because we'll see next time in Daniel chapter 7 that the lion empire is Babylon. So maybe the idea here is that this new Medo-Persian empire, we have that old Babylon lion empire locked up in the basement. We're the new boss, and even lions are under our control now. But as we read and see, all these beasts really belong to God, and they will do his bidding. They will spare Daniel and devour his wicked enemies. So don't worry about the lions in the basement, and don't fear the lion empire. Fear God. And we're going to make this thing, sign it so that it can't be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. And this is part of the contest in empire time, is who is in charge, who do you fear, who has the final word. Previous chapters had dealt with in Babylon time with the question, who's the real God? Nebuchadnezzar has to learn who God Most High is. He's the God of the Jews. He has authority over worship. He has authority to rule kings. Nebuchadnezzar gets it and is converted. But now we have kind of a new challenge here. When the Medo-Persians come in, they've got this law that they've made for themselves, that our law is absolute and unchanging and unchallengeable. And when a society starts thinking that we have the ultimate and final say about everything, hey, we voted on it, we got the majority, it's now the law of the land, and not know how can appeal or challenge this. Well, that's basically blasphemy. Only God's word is absolute. Only God's word stands forever. So don't try it. It won't work well. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. That's what they're falling back on. That's what their hope is in. That's how they're going to make this work, because our law is absolute and cannot be changed. And that's what we're counting on. Well, no. So, verse 10, Daniel knew that the document had been signed, and he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked, by the way. Then they answered and said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but he makes his petition 3 times a day. Gotcha. Well, why is Daniel praying in his upper chamber with windows open toward Jerusalem? I don't like the idea that because Jerusalem is somehow where God lives. Because, okay, for decades, Jerusalem has been a ruin with no people and no temple there. So why pray towards a ruin? And remember, Ezekiel had clearly seen the glory of the Lord depart from Jerusalem, comes up out of the temple, leaves the city, goes across the thing, leaves. And then Ezekiel sees the glory of God by the river. in Babylon. So God is now with his people in exile. He's not back there somehow. So I don't think I don't think we should think about this as Daniel somehow praying towards where God is, because it doesn't say that. His windows are open towards Jerusalem, but he got down on his knees and he prays and gives thanks before his God. He's not praying to Jerusalem; he's praying to God. So as we'll see in chapter 9, I think Daniel has done the math, though, and he knows that it's time for the return. So he opens his windows towards Jerusalem, not to pray towards Jerusalem, but to pray for Jerusalem. This is his prayer list, okay? I've got my list in front of me. Who am I going to pray for today? And I look at my list, and I'm going to pray for my neighbor, and my friend, and my family, and my, whoever the missionary is that I'm praying for. And Daniel has his prayer list before him, and his window is open toward Jerusalem, and I'm praying for Jerusalem. So I think that's a much better way to think about it. Some people suggest that he's got the windows open towards Jerusalem because he's got this kind of, face Mecca kind of deal going on. And I don't think that that's it at all. So Daniel 6, and we're in verse 14. The king heard these words, and he was much distressed. And he set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored until the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." So the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lord, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. And then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, sleep fled from him. And then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Well, first of all, notice that here in verse 16, all the things that they do here, these are very similar to the. I mean, this is a death and resurrection kind of a thing for Daniel. He goes into death, and then he is raised. And this the den that he's thrown into is like the tomb, and a stone is brought and laid across the mouth, and it's sealed with the king's signet and with the signet of his lord. So nothing can be changed concerning Daniel. I mean, okay, where else in Scripture do you have a tomb-like place that has a stone rolled across it and that is sealed so that it can't be broken into, so it's official? Daniel here is undergoing a death and resurrection kind of thing, and the king is going to then live to see Daniel come out of the grave, basically. The king went to his palace and spent the night fasting for Daniel. And then notice, too, here in this portion of the chapter, that the point of view is absolutely on the king. The point of view of the narration is all about the king. This is not a story about Daniel anymore. This is a story about the king. The king heard, the king labored, the king commanded, the king declared, the king sealed, the king fasted, the king arose, the king hurried, the king cried out in anguish. Think about that. What is the point? Do you suppose that this story then is about the emperor who is learning and looking and waiting to see if there will be a resurrection? Verse 21, then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad, and he commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Well, notice a couple of things here. One is the similarity, and we're recalling already back to chapter 3, where the boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are thrown into the burning fiery furnace. And just like there was an angel with them, one like the Son of Man in the furnace, there is an angel with Daniel in the den, one like the fourth one, like the fourth one in the furnace in chapter 3. God is with his people in trial. God is with Daniel in the grave, in the lion's den. And then also like chapter 3, when they bring the boys out of the furnace, there's no smell of smoke on them, and their office is restored. Here we've got no kind of harm was found on Daniel. Very striking kind of repetition of those kinds of elements, and we can expect that Daniel's office is also then going to be restored. Then those men who had maliciously accused Daniel have come to the end that they had wished on Daniel. Now, this is not a crazy idea, and this is not just some barbaric Persian kind of justice. This is actually an eye for eye provision that's straight out of the law of Moses. If you look in I think it's Deuteronomy, we'll look at it here in a minute. One of the eye for eye provisions in the law of Moses was that if an accuser's case cannot be substantiated, then the accuser has to suffer the punishment that he wants for the accused. And think about that. That would put an end to a lot of nuisance lawsuits. If I sue my neighbor and I want him to go to jail because his dog did something, and if I can't prove it, then I have to go to jail, I would think twice before I brought that lawsuit. Anyhow, okay, it's Deuteronomy 19, which says, if a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days, and the judges shall inquire diligently. And if the witness is a false witness and accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity, it shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So when the judges judge, they go, what is this guy trying to get from his neighbor? How is he trying to harm him? That is what will be measured against him. As you do to others, it shall be done to you, in that kind of eye for eye system of justice. So Deuteronomy 19 is another way to think about what's happening to the enemies of Daniel in chapter 6. Finally, then, we come to the end, verse 25. King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who saved Daniel from the power of the lions. And so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, or even the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Darius writes the same kind of letter here, or proclamation, that St. Nebuchadnezzar wrote back at the end of chapter 3 and at the end of chapter 4. So it's impressive here that these empires, they contain all the kingdoms, they rule over Israel, one among many whom they have subdued. But these empires are exposed to the one true living God because of the way God has acted with Israel, taking them and scattering them and throwing them and planting them across the earth. So the one true living God, they begin to know him, they begin to see him, they begin to confess him. So in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar confesses the one true living God. Here in Persia, Persians take over. Cyrus confesses the one true living God. Don't have a story about Greece, but we do have the stories about Rome, the Roman Empire, the centurion, and Jesus that Jesus talks to confesses. The centurion, the soldier, Roman soldier at the foot of the cross at the end of Mark, looks on Jesus as this is the Son of God. And then finally, the Emperor Constantine converts and stops Roman persecution and begins the time of the church being honored and respected in the empire. So there is a salt and light effect that happens because of the exile. And so then we've talked about verse 28 again. Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, even or to wit, or namely, the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The reign of Darius, that is the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That's how I'm reading it. I think that's the best way to understand who this Darius is. Darius is his Medo name, and Cyrus is his Persian name, and no problem. So that's the end for the lesson 6 here in our survey of Daniel. Next week, we'll look at chapter 7 and see beasts, and we actually come back then to the, I think it's time to come back to the Hebrew section.